Today's conversation is about how listening and storytelling can transform the way products are designed and how they can connect with people. If you're interested in leadership, how storytelling can play a role in creating impactful products, this conversation is for you. I'm Esther Choy. I'm the founder of Leadership STORYLAB, where I coach senior executives in storytelling. In addition to my book, Let the Story Do the Work, I'm also a contributor to Forbes Leadership Strategy channel. You can also find my opinion pieces at Harvard Business Review, New York Times, and Entrepreneur. Today, my guest is Malin Leschly. She's the Chief Design Officer at Logitech, and in her capacity, she leads a brilliant team of designer, researcher, marketer, ethnographer, where they research, design, and create electronic products that cater to their users. If you are interested in hearing more conversation like this, be sure to hit subscribe, because I will be speaking to many more other industry leaders where we will discover together the power of storytelling and the role that it plays in amplifying one's leadership voice. If you want to learn more about business storytelling, make sure you check out my website, leadershipstorylab.com. And now let's dive in. What does a chief design officer actually do? And what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, the day-to-day is very varied, because a chief design officer, fundamentally, we look at the experiences that we create and make sure that that experience encompass everything that we stand for and what we want the user to get out of that experience. And I think one way to answer it is to back up and say, what is design, right? What am I the chief officer of? And I think of design as creating experiences that balance craft, creativity, and constraints, and a deep, deep understanding of users' insights. So it's many aspects to it. So in my day-to-day job, it's all about the experiences and the user insights. And then the craft, the design disciplines where we have industrial designers, colors, material, finishes, user experience designers, packaging and all of that. And then the constraints, because fundamentally we are a company and we want to do this at scale. And we have sustainability ambitions, inclusivity ambitions. So it's managing and balancing all of that. And so some days I'm all into design reviews. Some days it's all business. Some days I'm out with teams. It's very varied, which I love, because what drives me is curiosity and learning. I love that. So it's the perfect, it's a dream job.
Can you just comment on why is it important when you are the leader? Why is listening important?
That's a great question. For a couple of reasons. First, because good ideas can come from anywhere. And it's very important to listen, because only then will you pick up the good ideas. The second one is I believe in listening because there are the stories that we tell ourselves, or the narratives that we tell ourselves. And then there's often the real stories, right? This is also why I'm also passionate about storytelling, just like you, because we use stories to make sense of the world. And so they're the stories that we tell ourselves. And only by really, really listening can you go beyond the first story and try to understand more. And that is very, very helpful for me, both as a team leader, but also in design, right, where it's really about user insights. So I tend to listen a lot. And because I'm curious, because I'm motivated by learning, that's an easy one for me, because I am really curious. And I'm often, people now make fun of me because I always will say, wow, tell me more. And it's a genuine question, but I often respond, even if people are frustrated, it's like, tell me more. Where is that coming from? Because I find that that is asking without judgment, without preconceived notions, without assumptions. Sometimes it's about not what I think it is or even what the person thinks it is, but it's about something else. And so I think of listening as a superpower.
How do you get your teams to also embrace that mindset?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am a big believer in making the implicit explicit. And so working on making our norms, our expectations, and our behaviors, what do we expect from each other, explicit. And it's super important in a company like Logitech. We're a global company. We're present everywhere across. And as a global company, we bring our own cultural assumptions, our ways of working, our understandings of day to day. You know, we might be working odd hours to catch teammates, and we might have very different communication styles. What's funny in one country may not perceive to be funny in another. Culture references might be very different. And so I lead and I manage with a focus on listening and positive intent. Assume positive intent, but be very clear, right? Only goes so far. So it's not about being a pushover, but it's about really understanding that the way someone might see the world, let's not assume that that's the way someone else sees the world, because there's so much richness in all of us. And it's super important in a global company to really lean into that. So that's how I try to manage that is whenever in my leadership team, in my leaderships team, there's a focus on what are the norms and behaviors? How do we lead here? How do we drive towards goals?
Can you think of a specific instance where that leads to doors being open that you didn't expect?
Yeah, yes, I think there many, and we're actually right now in the midst of something. So when we think of, I lead the creative and the design org at Logitech, and traditionally they're very separate disciplines, and they're handoffs. Many similarities. And what we're doing now is that we're looking across and we're realizing the synergies that exist between the two. And the only way we get there is by parking our notions of what it is, looking at what we want to do, and then pulling back and seeing what are the similarities and ways we can do there. So doing an end-to-end look at what is it that we're doing, where we want to go, and how do we accomplish that? So it's very exciting because teams now do a lot more cross-collaboration with each other. And that only works if we do this, where we really listen. What are we trying to accomplish? And we assume positive intent.
I wonder if we can sort of synthesize all of that and bridge it over to storytelling. You mentioned that to you, storytelling is sense making.
Yeah.
And that's in one of your LinkedIn posts for International Women's Day. I'll ask my Esther question. What does that mean? That sounds great. Storytelling and sense making. What does that mean? And how this idea impacts the way that you lead?
Yeah. So the most frequent reasons throughout my career when I have been asked to mentor someone, or people have reached out, can you mentor me? Or I get requests from other managers, can you mentor so-and-so? Is because of my storytelling.
Oh.
It's because I I believe that storytelling and storytelling is very closely linked to thinking and how we think about things. Mm-hmm. And as humans, and this is very relevant in design, there's rational relevance and there's emotional relevance. Mm. And the rational relevance can be, well, I need a computer mouse because otherwise it's really hard to, interact with my computer. It just makes it easier. It really extends my potential. The emotional relevance is that the mouse that you pick tells you something about you, and it also tells others something about you. So you might pick a mouse that's all about the performance, or one that's very colorful and feels very expressive and what you stand about. So this goes through in the storytelling too. What is it that at the core of the story that is about the rational relevance? But what is it also that will hit the nerve on the emotional relevance? So whenever I talk to people about storytelling, it always starts with, well, who are you trying to tell this story to? Uh-huh. Right? What is it that they care about? What's important to them? Then the second thing is, what are you trying to say? And be very clear with yourself, who and what. But third is, that's not enough. Why does that matter? Why does that matter to them? How does it help them to make sense of whatever it is? And then the fourth thing, which is so important and super exciting to be in the world of creative and design, is how do we tell that story? Because that influences so much of how the what and the why is perceived and how it lands in who you're telling it to. So those four things. So I always drive that very clearly in how I do my storytelling, in how I want my teams to do their storytelling. And I'm a big believer in when we do storytelling in professional settings to try to be crisp and clear.
I wonder, are there any secret sauce that you can share in terms of aesthetically, how do you get the stories of your users and how do you then in turn incorporate in your products that would reflect that aesthetics?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. So there's several aspects to it. The first is really about deeply understanding our users. Mm-hmm. And we communicate not just with our words, but also with our body language. So our insights teams is very much trained they meet with users, they're in users' homes, they look at as much as what you say as what you don't say. Mm-hmm. And so that is how we get rich insights that are both filled with rational and emotional relevance. Then as we think about creating product experiences, we exist in a competitive landscape. We know that our users and our choosers in enterprise contexts, they have a lot of products or solutions to pick from. Uh-huh. So it's really about us understanding deeply and then balances the craft creativity and the constraints at hand to figure out a solution. And so we work very closely with our engineering teams about the rational relevance. Oftentimes there are things that we need to hit. There are features, speeds in gaming that you care about, that you just have to have it in the experience. Otherwise, they're not even considered. And then there's also, we work with engineering on the emotional relevance and our teams on, so I don't know if you can see right? This might look strange. If I ask you to picture a computer mouse, you might not picture this one at first, right? But this one is a great example of both rational and emotional relevance. We all can get fatigued if you use a mouse or we use it in we don't have the best workstations or how we sit. But how this one actually conforms to my hand. You touch it and you're like, oh, I get it, right? There's both rational and emotional relevance in that. But the way that we sculpt this, you talk about aesthetics, and the aesthetics goes hand in hand with the function. So it tells you something, both, actively communicated, but also things like you say, sometimes we can't articulate it, but it looks comfortable. It looks different. It looks comfortable. When I touch it, it's hard to see here. There are ridges here that just feel great. So our designers are also trained in thinking about what are the cues in the experience that will both make you feel rationally like, yes, this is for me, but also that emotional appreciation that might be hard to articulate, but that you feel when you interact with the product. Same thing with our creative when we talk about our products and what we communicate there.
I think I understand in terms of from the company side, how do you incorporate it? How do you communicate back to the users? But I'm wondering from more the ethnography, the user research, and understanding your users, how do you get to that, what they deeply wanted, but probably can't articulate themselves? How do you get them to tell you that stories? Because I know the researchers, they're hanging out. I know ethnography. I know there's a process to this, but I'm really curious. I think for the non-designers, non-ethnographers, there's something about being able to get to your audience's stories that is just gold mine. And so without being a trained ethnographer, user experience researchers, how do people do that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So the founder of Non-Object, which was the design studio where I was before Logitech and which then got absorbed into Logitech, he always used to say that design is a positive, meaningful surprise. And I love that saying because positive, right? It needs to add something to your life. Meaningful, it fills a role for you, whatever that role is. And the surprise, it does something that you perhaps didn't anticipate or even know that you wanted, right? That's the best design. And so how do we get there? The first one is to be curious and make observations. Observe our users, understand our users, do research about our users. What do they do? What do they say matters? Then the second thing is talking and asking specific questions. When we do, we sequence those questions very specifically to not steer them in a particular direction.
Can you give me an example?
Yes. Tell me how you, Esther, tell me how you start writing a story. And you would say something, okay, and then what do you do? And then what do you do? So it's letting the story unfold from your perspective instead of saying, hey, Esther, when you do a story, do you do a mic? Do you have a mic when you interview people? Then do you use a keyboard to type it? And, how does the mouse feel in your hand, right? There are a lot of assumptions when I ask questions like that. So very, very open questions. And to oftentimes when we ask questions, people will say, well, how does this work if we show them something? It's very easy then to say, well, it just works like this and it's great. We thought of everything. Is to always say, what do you think? Because only then can we figure out, okay, maybe they're doing something that we didn't expect. They'll surprise us. And it happens all the time when we do user research, that people surprise us because they don't do or use things the way we may have intended when we design something.
Right.
But that sparks new opportunities for us. And so it's observing, it's asking, and it's listening. It's again going back to listening to as much as what they say as what they don't say. And then seeing, faces. You might tell us, this is great, I love it. But you can see in the body language that there's something there. Maybe they don't love it, or maybe they're holding back something. Maybe they're just agreeing because they're telling us what, we want to hear. So it's really a skill to do good insights, and it's fundamental for what we do.
Yeah. And this is so pertinent to not just design, but to anyone who wants to reach their audience. It's to dispense your own story and be curious and empathetic enough to have a blank slate, white, empty palette, to know what the world looks like, feel like for your audience.
Absolutely.
I want to show you a few photographies. It might seem like it has nothing to do with you and your work, but on a gut level, I connected those two instantly. And this is a bunch of photographers. They're all photographies that are all black and white, and they are done in the early 90s in a neighborhood in Chicago. That's where I'm based, called the Pilsen neighborhood. Primarily immigrant, and primarily Mexican immigrants. And a photography student from Japan started taking pictures there. And he took a whole bunch. And then he graduated, he went home, he put them all in a box, and then in the box they sat for 20 years. And then he, about 10, 15 years ago, he was cleaning out his place, and he's reminiscing his time as a student. And then he wondered what happened to all those people he took photos of. So he put them all on Facebook. And then he's basically putting it out there and say, can somebody please help me find them? And then that was then when it created this instant fandom, if you will, of, oh my gosh, first is, that's me, that's my neighbor, that's my relatives, that's my aunt. And then to, wow, look at these photos. And so a month ago, the Chicago Public Library, they acquire a big part of his work in their special archives. And then a month ago, there's a special exhibit about his photo. So if I may, so that's on the cover. This particular one's on the cover of his book, this one. I'm just going to go through. His English at the time wasn't great. He did not speak any Spanish. And yet people welcome him into their home, into their community center, into their basically private space, and just let him take photos. And at the opening of the exhibit, I heard the alderman, I heard community leaders from Pilsen's raved about his work and how touched they were about his work. And in my mind, I went to, wow, he's Japanese. He's not American. He's a student. He didn't even speak Spanish. And in nowadays, where there's this whole sense of, if you're not from this community, you're not really supposed to tell the story of this community or try to represent this community, it's exactly opposite with him. They embraced it. Yeah. So I just want to get your commentary on this.
Yeah. I love it. The first thing that I heard, right, was this, that he's Japanese. So he comes in with a different perspective. right? And probably without assumptions. And I think so fundamentally, people as humans, we want to be seen and we want to be heard, right? And we want to be understood. And to have someone to come in without preconceived notions and take pictures like that, what came through to me too is that they weren't posing, really, right? It wasn't the traditional posing pictures, but he was just capturing, right? There is something about that in being seen, being genuinely seen. And then, right, by being seen, you feel more heard. And there was such authenticity in those pictures. And I love that. There's a book called Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Sabine. She is it's a young adult novel, actually, about gaming, and not something that I would normally read, but someone on my team recommended it, and he said it's fantastic. And our reading styles are very different, but I read it. But in that book, there is this quote that talks about exactly what you were saying. And I'll find the quote, and this is one of those where I'll follow up with you, where it talks about today that you cannot comment or build on other people's works because it's very quickly can fall into cultural appropriation, that you're sensitive, and there are so much there, right, that there has been appropriated, but it also does something with empathy and the ability of us to be able to especially in art, right, to reach across and to try to understand and to build on and this richness as we have as humans. So I love that story that he did and what he did, that it resonated so deeply because fundamentally it's human, right? It's a human perspective that he brought, and the fact that he wasn't in the community, I think, added to it. It didn't take away from the story, it added to it.
Yes. And because unfortunately, how that community get represented oftentimes elsewhere, it's very slanted.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so someone from or their community or not coming in and really see them for who they are.
Yeah.
I could see, my suspicion is why, despite him not being from the community, his work so resonate and so touched people from their community.
Yeah.
But one thing I couldn't get him to answer, I think because culturally, his modesty, it's hard to, or maybe even hard to put words to, that whenever I go to Japan, I feel like my aesthetics, my tastes automatically get upgraded because I'm around constantly so many beautiful things, simple, beautiful things. And so I think he probably couldn't comment on, well, because I grew up in this and this culture and this influences. But I think you might be able to comment a bit on, especially what does Scandinavian aesthetics or design value, what does that mean, and how does that influence the work that you do?
Yeah, it's a huge influence, right? And it's one of those influences that I, like him, perhaps may not be fully aware of until others call me out on it. And there's a lot of similarities in Japanese aesthetics and Scandinavian aesthetics. And it's this love of simplicity, ease of use, that it's fit for purpose. And that's why design is so pervasive when you go to the Scandinavian countries. You grab the door handle in a roadside restaurant and it just fits in your hand. You touch the faucet and it may not be the most beautiful faucet, but it's beautiful in its simplicity and it just works. You sit down in a chair in a 7-Eleven, and there's a lit candle in the morning because of the darkness, and there's actually a little seating area. Very simple, but there's a thoughtfulness to the simplicity where it goes back to who will use this and why. And then the other aspect of it, I think, is appreciating natural beauty, right? There's Scandinavians spend a lot of time outdoors. They embrace the elements. They're very nature focused in a way. So it's much about appreciating natural beauty and appreciating things for what they are, not too stylized. And it's very essential in a way. And that's where I think also the crossover with.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I think he would be very delighted to hear his aesthetic explained in Scandinavian angle, but this overlap and similarities. If I may close with this question, kind of bringing it back to storytelling. I read the Medium article about you and your childhood, and with your family of 4 road tripping in the little Renault. There's something very relatable and very humble about that image. And so I think I guess that's splintered into the questions about why do you choose to share that story from your childhood? And related to it, is there an impact to how you arrive changes the perspectives of when you arrive?
Oh, beautiful. Mm-hmm.
And then this could be a follow-up questions if you want to take some more time with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that story came about because Thomas, who interviewed me, asked me about how I ended up in America. Why am I here? And I said, well, I'm curious. I've always loved languages. My father was a high school teacher and a translator for Swedish television. So languages and curiosity about other cultures was something that we discussed every night at the kitchen table. And every summer we would go, drive around Europe because many Scandinavians have this little summer cottage and they go to my parents never did. So we always traveled around Europe. And then he asked more questions. Oh, how did you do that? And I said, well, it's actually a funny story. We didn't have a lot of money. We piled into this little car. And so that's where that came from. It wasn't an intentional share, but it was very important for how I look at things. That was the first time when I got to experience as a child that how we do things at home may not necessarily be how other people do things. And both things, but it works beautifully either way. So getting that appreciation, cultivating a sense of their different perspectives, equally valid, different ways of doing things, equally valid, and getting to the same thing. I also think that to how you arrive and when there is something to be said for slowness and for taking your time. And I find that also in the context of storytelling, that letting a story mature a little bit, because when you let the story mature, you let your thinking mature. And it's just taking the time, appreciating the nuances, appreciate it so that when you get there, your story might be more fleshed out, but along with it, your thinking is also more fleshed out.
Why is it important for leaders to tell stories, especially the one that we're talking about? I can see a business story, but something more personal, not private stories, but personal stories. Why is that important for leaders to do that?
It's about connection, I think. And I think it goes back to storytelling being sense making. For for the people that we lead to make sense of the stories that we tell, and both the explicit stories that we tell, but the implicit stories that we tell, and how we lead, how we show up. There needs to be connection and a deeper understanding of the person. And so getting a peek about, of the person behind the story, I think is helpful, right? Fundamentally, it's through the connection that we tie, that we understand, and that we make sense. So I'm a big believer. I'm often told that I, as a leader, am perceived as being direct and transparent. What you see is what you get, kind of, because I share things, I don't hold back on certain things. And the way I tell stories is about authenticity.